The quiet of the night was shattered by the sound of a scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was a cry of pure terror, desperate and raw, the kind that cut through the cold air and sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. Moments later, an explosion of flames burst through the windows of a modest two-story home, engulfing the structure in a blazing inferno. The glow of the fire illuminated the sleeping neighborhood, transforming the once peaceful street into a scene of chaos and panic. The scent of burning wood, plastic, and something more ominous, something that carried the stench of finality, filled the air. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, barefoot, wrapped in robes, their breath visible in the night chill. Some shouted, others fumbled for their phones to call 911, their hands trembling as they tried to process what was happening. Inside the burning house, behind thick, suffocating smoke and collapsing walls, was Elizabeth Bell, a 28-year-old mother. Somewhere inside that inferno, she was fighting for her life. Firefighters arrived within minutes, their sirens screaming louder than the terrified voices in the street. Water blasted from the hoses, hissing as it met the flames, creating a dense steam that clouded the air. A crew moved quickly toward the front entrance, their boots crunching over broken glass and embers as they tried to make their way in. But the fire had already consumed too much. And then, just as the rescue team fought against the blaze, someone stumbled out from behind the house. A man, barely able to stand, his skin burned, his clothes in tatters. He was Frank J. Brett Jr., Elizabeth's former partner. His face was contorted in pain, but his eyes held something else. Not just shock, not just agony, something deeper. He collapsed onto the pavement, barely conscious. Paramedics rushed to his side, checking for vitals, stabilizing him as best they could. But even as they worked on him, their attention kept shifting back to the house, the flames still roaring, still devouring everything inside. A woman in the crowd gasped, her voice trembling. "Where's her daughter?" For a moment, silence. Then a firefighter emerged from the smoke, carrying a small child in his arms, Elizabeth's 7-year-old daughter. She was coughing, her face streaked with soot, but she was alive. The girl clung to her rescuer, dazed, her small hands gripping his uniform, as if it was the only solid thing in the world. But Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. When the fire was finally extinguished, what remained of the house was nothing but a skeletal frame, charred beyond recognition. Inside, near what was once the bedroom, they found her. The sight was grim. Elizabeth's body was badly burned, almost unrecognizable. But there was something strange, something that told investigators immediately that this was no accident. The way the fire had spread, the intensity of the burns on her body compared to the rest of the house. And then there was the smell, gasoline. The first responders exchanged glances, their faces grim. Fires had patterns, and this one screamed intentional. The police arrived soon after, securing the scene as detectives stepped in, their trained eyes scanning for clues, their minds already piecing together the puzzle before them. One officer turned toward the paramedics treating Frank Brett, who was now groaning in pain. His burns were severe, but not as severe as they should have been for someone supposedly caught in the fire. Another officer stepped over the blackened remains of the bedroom, noticing something half-melted near the door. A plastic container, its edges warped by the heat. It reeked of gasoline. There was no doubt anymore. This was not just a tragic fire. This was murder. The fire had left nothing but destruction in its wake. The house that once stood as a home for Elizabeth Bell and her young daughter was now a hollowed-out shell, its walls blackened, its structure weakened by the intensity of the flames. Smoke still curled from the charred remains, drifting into the night sky as firefighters continued their final sweep, ensuring that no hidden embers remained. But even as the last of the fire was extinguished, the true nature of this scene was becoming alarmingly clear. This was no accident. The first responders had seen enough fires to recognize the signs. The way the flames had spread, the sheer force of the burn in the specific areas, it suggested something far more sinister than an electrical fault or an unattended candle. There was a pattern to the destruction, one that indicated the deliberate use of an accelerant. The smell of gasoline still lingered, unmistakable even beneath the overpowering stench of smoke and melted plastic. As investigators moved cautiously through the remains, they knew they had to work fast. Time was crucial. Any evidence that had survived the inferno would be fragile, easily lost if not handled with precision. They focused their attention on what used to be the bedroom, the place where Elizabeth Bell had been found. Her body was barely recognizable, burned beyond anything natural, far worse than what an ordinary fire would inflict. Outside, the crowd of neighbors grew. Some stood in shock, whispering to one another, exchanging worried glances. Others were on their phones, calling friends, spreading the news of what had happened. A few had tears in their eyes. They had known Elizabeth. She had lived there for years, raising her daughter, working long hours to provide for her child. She had been seen just days before, smiling as she ran errands, completely unaware that death was waiting for her inside her own home. But one person in that crowd stood out. Frank J. Brett Jr. was hunched over, his body covered in burns, his face twisted in pain. He was being treated by paramedics, his breathing heavy, his hands trembling. He looked as though he had barely escaped with his life. But to the trained eyes of the detectives watching him, something felt wrong. He had burns, yes, but they were inconsistent with someone who had been trapped inside a raging fire. His injuries suggested exposure, but not prolonged entrapment. It was as if he had been close enough to be affected, but not close enough to have been in real danger. A detective approached, standing just outside the ambulance as the paramedics worked. "Can you tell me what happened?" His voice was even, controlled. Frank hesitated, his lips parting before closing again. Then finally he spoke. I tried to save her," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "I swear, I tried." The detective's eyes didn't leave him. "How did the fire start?" Frank shook his head. I don't know. I was inside and suddenly, flames. It happened so fast." A weak explanation. Too weak. The detective noted the way Frank avoided looking directly at him, the way his fingers curled and uncurled against the edge of the stretcher. It was the kind of nervousness that came not from trauma, but from knowing more than he was admitting. The paramedics interrupted, needing to transport Frank to the hospital. The detective didn't stop them. He simply watched as Frank was wheeled into the ambulance, committing every detail of his demeanor to memory. This wasn't the last conversation they would have. Back at the crime scene, forensic specialists were making their own discoveries. Near the bedroom door, partially melted but still recognizable, was a plastic container. The smell of gasoline was strongest there. It was an accelerant used to intentionally spread the fire. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to set a fire. They wanted Elizabeth trapped inside. Then another discovery, a lighter found just outside the house. The fire hadn't spread naturally, it had been ignited. Police began knocking on doors, questioning the neighbors, piecing together what had happened in the moments leading up to the blaze. A woman who lived across the street came forward. She had been awake when it happened. She had heard something before the fire started. Arguing, voices raised in anger. A man and a woman. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Then silence. And then the flames. Another witness claimed they had seen movement around the house before the fire began. A figure hard to make out in the darkness, but undeniably there. And then, the most chilling discovery of the night. Near the wreckage of the kitchen, buried beneath debris, lay Elizabeth's phone. It had been damaged, scorched at the edges, but investigators would be able to extract data from it. And when they did, they would see her final messages. One of them had been sent just minutes before the fire started. 3 simple words. "He's here." The sun had barely begun to rise when the crime scene unit arrived, their presence adding an official weight to the grim atmosphere that had settled over the ruined house. The street, still lined with curious onlookers, had taken on an eerie stillness. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, exchanging speculation, their eyes shifting between the smoldering wreckage and the yellow police tape that blocked off the property. The investigators ignored the murmurs, their focus locked on the scene before them. Every detail, no matter how small, could be a clue, an answer waiting to be uncovered. Inside what remained of the house, forensic specialists moved methodically, their movements precise, their steps careful as they navigated the blackened ruins. The acrid smell of burnt plastic and gasoline still lingered. clinging to the air in an oppressive cloud. It had been hours since the fire was extinguished, but the house still felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded within them. The damage was extensive. Most of the furniture had been reduced to charred remnants, the walls barely holding together. The ceiling partially collapsed in places where the fire had raged hottest. Despite the destruction, there were patterns, distinctive burn marks that told a story clearer than any words could. Fires, when left to spread naturally, followed a predictable path. But here the damage was too specific, the intensity too concentrated in certain areas. The fire hadn't consumed the house in a random, uncontrolled blaze. It had been guided, fueled by something more than just wood and fabric. Investigators paused near what had once been the bedroom. This was where Elizabeth Bell had died, where the flames had been fiercest, where the fire had done its worst. Her body had already been removed, transported to the medical examiner's office, but the evidence she left behind remained. Near the doorway, a melted plastic container lay partially buried beneath the debris, its edges twisted by the heat but still recognizable. The scent of gasoline clung to it, unmistakable even amid the overpowering stench of smoke and destruction. It was a damning piece of evidence, one that pointed to deliberate ignition. The person responsible hadn't just set fire to the house, they had poured accelerant, ensuring that once the flames took hold, there would be no escape. A few feet away, another discovery, a lighter, blackened but intact. It would need to be tested for fingerprints, but its presence alone was enough to solidify the growing certainty among the investigators. This was arson. Outside, detectives continued their work, questioning the neighbors, piecing together the events leading up to the fire. The statements they gathered formed a troubling picture. Multiple witnesses reported hearing an argument before the fire started. A man and a woman, voices raised in anger. Then, silence. And moments later, the fire erupted. One witness, an elderly woman who lived across the street, swore she had seen movement near the house shortly before the flames appeared. She couldn't identify the figure. It had been too dark, and the shadows played tricks on her aging eyes. But she was certain that someone had been there. Another neighbor, a young man returning home from a late shift at work, confirmed her account. He had noticed a car parked near Elizabeth's house at an unusual hour, one that left the scene just before the fire began. And then there was Frank J. Brett Jr. His burns were being treated at the hospital, his injuries significant but not life-threatening. Detectives had spoken to him briefly at the scene, but his story had been vague, his answers carefully chosen. He had claimed that he had been inside the house when the fire started, that he had tried to save Elizabeth but had been forced to flee when the flames became too much. But something about his words didn't sit right. His injuries suggested limited exposure to the fire, not the kind one would expect from someone trapped inside a burning building. More troubling was the fact that Elizabeth's final text message had named him. It had been retrieved from her damaged phone, the screen cracked but still functional enough to reveal the words she had sent just minutes before the fire. "He's here." There was no context, no explanation, but the weight of those two words was undeniable. She had been afraid. She had known someone was coming for her, and now she was dead. As the morning stretched on, the investigation intensified. Phone records were pulled, security footage from nearby homes and businesses was requested. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to recover what little evidence the fire had not destroyed. Every lead was followed, every inconsistency examined. At the hospital, Frank was under close watch. He was not yet under arrest. There wasn't enough concrete proof to charge him, but he was very much a person of interest. His burns were serious, but not nearly as severe as they should have been if his story was true. He had been close enough to the fire to be affected, but not close enough to be trapped. His account of the night was vague, full of gaps, carefully avoiding any specifics that could be checked against evidence. The detectives assigned to the case reviewed his history. He and Elizabeth had been in a relationship for years, but it had ended in conflict. There had been incidents, reports filed, warnings given. Nothing that had led to an arrest, but enough to suggest that their relationship had not been a peaceful one. And then there was the matter of the witnesses. The argument heard before the fire, the car seen leaving the area, the inconsistencies in Frank's injuries and his story. It was becoming clear that this was not a simple case of a tragic house fire. This was something much darker, much more intentional. Back at the scene, as investigators carefully sifted through the wreckage, a final discovery was made, one that solidified the case beyond a doubt. In a section of the house that had collapsed from the flames, buried beneath layers of ash and debris, they found a partially melted gasoline canister. The plastic had warped from the heat, but enough remained intact to confirm what they had already suspected. The fire hadn't just been set, it had been designed. Someone had wanted Elizabeth dead. Someone had made sure she had no way out. And now it was the investigators' job to find out who. The morning air was still thick with the remnants of smoke as detectives gathered at the precinct, their desks cluttered with reports, crime scene photographs, and witness statements. The night had been long, but the investigation was only beginning. Every piece of evidence needed to be examined. Every inconsistency in the timeline had to be addressed. And above all, the question that loomed over the case had to be answered. Who wanted Elizabeth Bell dead? At the heart of the investigation was Frank J. Brett Jr. His burns had been treated, and he was now resting in a hospital bed under watch. He had not been officially detained, but he was the only person linked directly to the scene, and the weight of suspicion pressed down on him like a storm cloud waiting to break. His initial statement was flimsy at best. He had claimed he tried to save Elizabeth, that he had been inside the house, but that the fire had spread too fast. Yet his injuries told a different story. He had suffered burns, but not nearly severe enough for someone trapped inside an inferno that had completely consumed the structure. Forensic specialists wasted no time processing the evidence retrieved from the crime scene. The lighter found near the house was carefully dusted for fingerprints, the melted gasoline canister was analyzed for trace residues, and Elizabeth's phone, damaged but not beyond recovery, was transferred to the digital forensics unit. Investigators knew that technology often held the key to unlocking a case. If Elizabeth had been afraid before her death, she might have left behind digital breadcrumbs leading straight to her killer. The first major breakthrough came when forensic analysis of the house confirmed gasoline as the accelerant. The fire had not been the result of an accident. It had been set with intent. The burn patterns were clear. The point of origin had been at the bedroom doorway, meaning the fire had been designed to trap Elizabeth inside. Whoever had done this had not just wanted to start a fire. They had wanted to ensure she had no way out. Back at the hospital, detectives prepared to re-interview Frank. His burns had been treated, but the weight of the situation was beginning to show in his expression. He was pale, his hands twitching slightly, his eyes darting between the officers in the room. His previous story had been vague, too vague. Now, faced with mounting evidence, he would have to be more specific. One detective leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Walk us through it again, step by step. How did the fire start?" Frank swallowed hard. "I don't know, I was inside. I smelled smoke. I tried to find her, but it was already too late." A pause. The silence stretched just long enough to make Frank shift uncomfortably. The detective let the tension settle before responding. "You said you were inside, but your burns suggest otherwise. You weren't caught in the flames the way Elizabeth was. So where exactly were you?" Frank's fingers clenched into the thin hospital blanket, his jaw tightening. "I told you. I tried to help." The detective exchanged a glance with his partner. "And yet, you made it out. She didn't." No answer. The silence was telling. Meanwhile, across town, forensic analysts had made another discovery, one that would add yet another crack to Frank's story. Data pulled from Elizabeth's phone showed her final text messages, the last digital trace of her before she died. The most damning message had been sent at 3:15 a.m., just minutes before the fire was reported. "He's here." There was no question about it. She had been afraid. She had known someone was coming for her. Detectives wasted no time pulling Frank's phone record. If he had been near Elizabeth's house when the fire started, the records would show it. Cell towers didn't lie. Within hours, the results came in. The data was clear. His phone had pinged off a tower near Elizabeth's home at the exact time the fire began. Now the case was taking shape. The evidence was stacking up. The gasoline, the lighter, the phone records, the inconsistencies in Frank's statement. It all pointed in one direction, But investigators knew that suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed an undeniable link, one that would hold up in court, one that would prove, beyond any doubt, that this wasn't just a tragic fire, it was murder. The autopsy report arrived that afternoon. The medical examiner's findings were chilling. Elizabeth had still been alive when the fire consumed her. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no indication that she had been incapacitated before the flames took hold. She had been awake, conscious, trapped as the fire devoured everything around her. The flames had not been what killed her instantly. It had been the heat, the smoke, the sheer agony of being burned alive. And someone had made sure that was exactly how she died. By the time night fell, detectives were ready to confront Frank again. They weren't going to arrest him. Not yet. They needed him to talk. And sometimes the weight of knowing that the walls were closing in was enough to make a suspect break. Frank was sitting upright in his hospital bed when the detectives entered. His eyes flicked to them, wary, tense. He had been in this position before. He had spoken to police before. But this was different. He knew it. The detective pulled out a folder and placed it on the small table beside the bed. "We've got a problem, Frank." His voice was steady, almost conversational. He flipped open the folder, revealing a photograph of the melted gasoline canister, then another of the lighter. This was found at the scene. Someone poured accelerant. Someone set that fire on purpose. No response. The detective flipped to another page, revealing the forensic analysis of the burn patterns. The fire started here, in front of the bedroom door. That means it was set to block the exit. He paused, watching Frank's reaction carefully. Whoever did this didn't just want to start a fire. They wanted Elizabeth to burn. Still, Frank said nothing. Then came the final card. The detective placed Elizabeth's phone records in front of him. The message, time-stamped at 3:15 a.m., was circled in red. "He's here." Frank's eyes flicked over the words. His breathing quickened, just slightly. It was subtle, but the detective caught it. She knew someone was there, Frank. She was afraid. And 5 minutes later, the house was on fire. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then Frank exhaled, his fingers digging into the hospital blanket. His gaze dropped to the floor. The detective leaned in slightly. "We're going to find out the truth. The only question is whether you're going to tell us now or whether we're going to put the pieces together without you." Frank's jaw clenched, his hands twitched. The air in the room felt suffocating, and for the first time since the fire, there was a flicker of something in his expression. Guilt. The investigation was no longer just about a house fire. It had evolved into a homicide case, one that carried the weight of premeditation, calculated execution, and the kind of brutality that sent a clear message. Elizabeth Bell had not died by accident. She had not been the victim of some random misfortune. Someone had wanted her gone, had made certain that her final moments were filled with terror and suffering. And now it was up to the investigators to expose the truth buried beneath the ashes. At the precinct, the lead detectives convened in a briefing room, the walls lined with crime scene photos, forensic reports, and the growing pile of evidence that all pointed in one direction: the lighter, the gasoline canister, the cell tower records placing Frank J. Brett Jr. near the scene just minutes before the fire erupted. Each piece of the puzzle painted an increasingly damning picture, but detectives knew better than to rely on circumstantial evidence alone. They needed more. Something undeniable. Something that would leave no room for doubt. The next step was to dig deeper into Frank's past. His name had surfaced in the investigation because of his connection to Elizabeth. But who was he beyond that? What kind of man was he? Had there been signs, warnings that had gone ignored? Investigators pulled his records, tracing his movements over the past several years. What they found was disturbing. Frank had a documented history of domestic violence allegations, incidents that had never escalated to formal charges, but had been troubling enough for multiple women to report him. There had been complaints from past girlfriends, testimonies of control, manipulation, and sudden bursts of rage. Each report told a similar story. Frank was a man who didn't handle rejection well. Most notably, Elizabeth herself had filed a protective order against him just months before the fire. The document was chilling in its simplicity. She had written that she feared for her safety, that Frank had been harassing her, showing up uninvited, making threats. Yet for reasons all too common in cases like these, the order had not been strictly enforced, and now she was dead. Detectives interviewed those closest to Elizabeth, friends, co-workers, even casual acquaintances who might have seen something she had confided in no one else. Each conversation added another layer to the story, filling in the blanks of her final months. She had been afraid. That fear had followed her like a shadow, growing stronger each time she saw Frank lurking near her home. Each time she found evidence that he had been there when she wasn't. A coworker recalled a conversation just a few weeks prior to her death. Elizabeth had mentioned feeling like she was being watched. She had spoken about how Frank had called her repeatedly despite her ignoring him, how he had waited for her outside her workplace, pretending it was a coincidence when she confronted him. Another friend described a night when Elizabeth had stayed at her house because she was too afraid to go home alone. She hadn't gone into detail, but her hands had been shaking. Detectives pieced together her timeline, tracking the growing intensity of her distress. They compiled text messages, call logs, security footage where he had been seen driving past her house at odd hours. All signs pointed to a man who had refused to accept that their relationship was over. The autopsy report had already confirmed what detectives feared. Elizabeth had been alive when the fire started. She had been awake. She had known. And the final message on her phone, "He's here," was not just a passing text. It had been a plea for help. The evidence continued to build, but detectives knew they needed one more piece, a definitive link between Frank and the accelerant used in the fire. That proof came from an unexpected place. One of the forensic analysts reviewing surveillance footage from a gas station less than 2 miles from Elizabeth's home flagged something unusual. A timestamp from just 20 minutes before the fire showed a man purchasing a canister of gasoline and a lighter. The footage was grainy, the angle imperfect. But when investigators enhanced the image, the identity of the man was unmistakable. It was Frank J. Brett Jr. He had bought the very tool that had turned Elizabeth's home into a death trap. This discovery changed everything. It wasn't just evidence, it was intent. It was proof that the fire had not been spontaneous. It had been planned. With this final revelation, detectives prepared to move forward. The case was no longer a question of if Frank had been involved. It was how much he had been planning it. The fire had been a weapon, and Elizabeth had been his target. And now the noose was tightening. The moment had come. The weight of evidence was no longer just a collection of circumstantial fragments. It had solidified into an undeniable force, one that would soon be impossible for Frank J. Brett Jr. to escape. The detectives knew it, the prosecutors knew it, and soon Frank would have to face it himself. The day began with the case briefing, a final review of every critical detail gathered so far. The room was filled with detectives, forensic analysts, and legal experts, all of them seated around a long table cluttered with case files, printed crime scene photos, and detailed reports. It was a scene of organized chaos, voices low but urgent, each member of the team ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. They were no longer dealing with theory. This was the culmination of painstaking investigation, every step taken to prove not just that a crime had been committed, but that it had been executed with deliberate intent. The gasoline canister and lighter found at the scene had both been matched to items purchased less than an hour before the fire, captured on surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. Frank had not been cautious. He had walked into the store in clear view of the camera, completed the transaction, and left without a second thought. He had driven to Elizabeth Bell's home, and within minutes of his arrival, she was dead. Then there were the phone records, damning in their precision. Elizabeth had texted a friend at 3:15 a.m. "He's here." The timestamp placed her final message within minutes of the fire igniting, a silent scream for help that had come too late. Cell tower pings from Frank's phone confirmed he had been in the area at the exact time the blaze had started. And, perhaps most chilling of all, the autopsy results had confirmed Elizabeth had been alive when the flames took her. There had been no blunt force trauma, no injuries to suggest she had been rendered unconscious before the fire began. She had been aware. She had suffered. As detectives prepared to formally charge Frank, there was one final element to consider: the psychology behind his crime. It was one thing to prove he had been there, that he had started the fire, that he had watched as the house burned and Elizabeth perished inside. But understanding why, the mind of a man who had made this choice was something else entirely. Frank Brett Jr. had never been convicted of a crime before, but his past spoke volumes. He had a history of control, relationships that followed the same disturbing pattern: charm, possession, escalating tension, and then rage. Elizabeth had been his longest relationship, the one he had invested the most in emotionally. When she left, he had unraveled. The protective order she had filed months prior, though not fully enforced, had been a clear indication of how deeply she feared him. Friends had described her increasing paranoia, how she had believed she was being watched, followed. And then there were his own words. In past messages to Elizabeth, in heated arguments that friends had overheard, Frank had made his intentions clear. He had told her, more than once, "If I can't have you, no one will." That morning, a team of officers arrived at the hospital where Frank was still recovering from his burns. His injuries were not severe, but they had been enough to keep him under medical supervision. He was sitting upright when they entered the room, the tension in his body evident even before he realized what was happening. A detective stepped forward. There were no dramatic words, no moments of hesitation. The time for uncertainty had passed. "Frank Brett Jr., you're under arrest for the murder of Elizabeth Bell." The cuffs clicked into place. The room was silent. Back at the precinct, the interrogation was prepared with surgical precision. There would be no gaps in questioning, no opportunity for Frank to twist the narrative. Detectives would lay out the facts in order, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for him to run. And yet, as the hours passed, as Frank sat under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, his expression remained eerily blank. He did not deny the allegations outright, nor did he offer explanations. He simply listened. Occasionally, his fingers would twitch, his jaw would tighten, but he kept his words measured, calculated. When presented with the gasoline purchase, he said nothing. When shown the cell tower data, placing him near the scene at the time of the fire, he remained silent. When detectives placed Elizabeth's final text in front of him, "He's here," there was a moment, just a flicker of something behind his eyes. But then it was gone. Frank Brett Jr. was not a man who would confess easily. He was not someone who would crumble under pressure. But the evidence was overwhelming, and soon, whether he admitted it or not, the law would make its case for him. As the day stretched into night, detectives stepped away, preparing for the next phase. The trial would be brutal, but the groundwork had been laid. The prosecution had everything they needed. The fire had been a weapon. The motive was control. The evidence was undeniable. Elizabeth Bell had died not by chance, but by design, and justice was coming. The arrest of Frank J. Brett Jr. sent ripples through the community. The quiet suburban streets that had once harbored little more than the occasional neighborhood dispute were now the backdrop of a high-profile murder case. The media had caught on quickly, and within days the story of Elizabeth Bell's tragic death was circulating across news outlets. Her face, once a symbol of warmth and resilience, was now frozen in the haunting context of an investigation that had revealed the cruel reality behind her final moments. The public wanted justice, but justice was rarely swift and never simple. Inside the Erie County District Attorney's office, the prosecution team gathered, sifting through the sheer volume of evidence that had been compiled. The case against Frank was strong. The forensics, the surveillance footage, the phone records, the witness testimonies. Each piece was damning on its own, but together they formed an unshakable narrative of premeditated murder. Prosecutor Lisa Hammond knew that while the case was compelling, it still had to be airtight. The defense would do everything possible to discredit the evidence, to cast doubt, to plant the seed of reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. And if there was one thing she had learned from years in the courtroom, it was that a single doubt, however small, could be the difference between a conviction and a miscarriage of justice. She pored over the timeline of events, ensuring that every moment leading up to Elizabeth's death was meticulously documented. The gas station footage showed Frank purchasing a gasoline canister and a lighter just 20 minutes before the fire. His phone had pinged off a cell tower near Elizabeth's home at the exact time the blaze began. The forensic analysis confirmed gasoline had been used to accelerate the fire, and Elizabeth had been trapped inside. Then there was the protective order. It was one of the most chilling pieces of evidence. A legal document in which Elizabeth had stated in no uncertain terms that she feared Frank. It was an official record of her desperation, her last attempt to protect herself before the worst had happened. But there was one major complication. Frank had not confessed. He had remained eerily silent, never admitting guilt, never offering an alternative explanation. His defense attorney, Michael Anders, had already begun crafting his strategy. It was clear that the defense would focus on the lack of direct physical evidence tying Frank to the scene. The gasoline? It was sold in hundreds of stores. The lighter? It could have belonged to anyone. The cell tower records? Not exact enough to prove he was at the house itself. Most troubling of all was the argument that Frank's burns suggested he had been close to the fire, not the one who set it. The defense would claim that Frank had arrived at the scene too late, that he had found the house already engulfed in flames, and that he had suffered burns trying to save Elizabeth. It was a weak excuse, but if the defense could spin it well enough, it could be dangerous in the hands of a skilled attorney. Lisa Hammond knew she had to dismantle every potential weakness before the trial began. The next step was jury selection. The case had received substantial media attention, meaning that finding impartial jurors would be a challenge. People had already formed opinions. Some believed Frank was guilty beyond question. Others were skeptical of a system that had failed Elizabeth when she needed protection the most. The process was grueling. Potential jurors were vetted, questioned, scrutinized for biases that could tilt the verdict in either direction. As this unfolded, detectives continued their work, going over every aspect of the case with forensic teams. One crucial question remained. Was there any additional evidence that could further incriminate Frank? The answer came in the form of a data recovery specialist who had been working to extract more information from Elizabeth's phone. The final text message had already been recovered. "He's here." But the specialist had found something even more disturbing. A voicemail. It was short, barely more than a whisper. It had been recorded automatically as an incoming call went to voicemail. Elizabeth's voice was shaky, strained. In the background there was a sound, a loud bang, the rustling of movement. And then, barely audible but unmistakable, a man's voice. "You think I won't do it?" Then silence. The timestamp. 3 minutes before the fire started. The recording was damning. It was a direct link between Frank and the crime. But there was one issue. The voice was distorted, partially muffled. The defense could argue that it wasn't Frank's voice, that it could have been anyone. But anyone who heard it would know the truth. Lisa Hammond wasted no time in preparing a motion to admit the recording as evidence. The defense would undoubtedly try to block it, claiming it was unreliable, inconclusive, inadmissible. But if the judge ruled in favor of the prosecution, it would be one of the most powerful pieces of evidence presented in court. With the trial date set, the case against Frank was stronger than ever. But in the world of criminal law, strength wasn't enough. It had to be bulletproof. And as the trial loomed, everyone involved in the case knew that the fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the trial of Frank J. Brett Jr. commenced. Spectators filled the benches, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, grief, and anticipation. The public had followed every detail of the case since the night of the fire, and now they were here, watching as the justice system decided the fate of the man accused of ending Elizabeth Bell's life. The room smelled of old wood and paper, the air thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. On one side, the prosecution team, meticulously prepared, their confidence rooted in an overwhelming stack of forensic evidence. Across from them sat the defense, their strategy simple but effective: to sow doubt, to make the jury question what they thought they knew. And then, in the center of it all, was Frank Brett Jr., his face blank, his demeanor composed, a man who had yet to acknowledge the weight of his actions. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose in unison. After the formalities, it was time for the case to be laid bare before the jury. Lisa Hammond, the district attorney leading the prosecution, rose to her feet. She was a veteran in high-profile homicide cases, but this one carried a different burden. Elizabeth had seen her death coming. She had reached out for help, but help had not arrived in time. And now it was Lisa's job to ensure that the man responsible for her suffering was held accountable. She stepped toward the jury box, her voice measured but firm as she delivered her opening statement. This is a case about control, about obsession, about a man who refused to accept that a woman had the right to leave him, a man who, in his final act of revenge, set a fire designed to trap and kill the person he claimed to love. She turned and gestured toward the defense table, locking eyes with the accused. The evidence will show that this was not an accident. This was not an act of desperation. This was planned, executed with intent, and done with a level of cruelty that is almost unfathomable. She allowed the weight of her words to settle before stepping back to her table, signaling for the first key piece of evidence. A screen flickered on, displaying grainy surveillance footage from a gas station just 20 minutes before the fire. The image zoomed in, revealing a man purchasing a gasoline canister and a lighter. There was no mistaking who it was. This, Lisa said, is Frank Brett Jr. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the timeline of the crime. The prosecution was establishing premeditation. This fire had not been an impulsive act of rage. It had been planned. Next, a forensic expert took the stand, walking the jury through the burn patterns found at the scene. He explained how gasoline had been poured strategically at the entrance of the bedroom, ensuring that once the fire started, there was no way out. The jury listened intently as he detailed how the flames had spread unnaturally fast, consuming everything in their path. Elizabeth had no chance of survival. And then came the most damning piece of evidence yet. The digital forensics analyst stepped forward, holding a printed record of Elizabeth's final text message. He adjusted the microphone before speaking. At 3:15 a.m., the victim sent her last message. It read, "He's here." The room was silent. The weight of those two words was undeniable. She had known who was coming for her. She had known she was about to die. After presenting their strongest evidence, the prosecution rested, their case airtight. But if Lisa Hammond had learned anything in her years as a prosecutor, it was that defense attorneys were relentless when it came to creating doubt. Michael Anders, Frank's lawyer, stood and buttoned his suit jacket before approaching the jury. His voice was calm, almost sympathetic. What happened to Elizabeth Bell is a tragedy. No one is disputing that. But what the prosecution wants you to believe, that my client set that fire, is a theory, not a fact. He took a slow step toward them. Gasoline is sold in thousands of stores across the country. A lighter? Even more common. And while they claim my client's phone was near the scene, cell tower data isn't precise enough to say exactly where he was. He turned to face the jury directly. And let's talk about something else. The burns on my client's body. If Frank Brett truly wanted to kill Elizabeth, why would he have put himself in harm's way? He let the question linger. What if I told you that the burns were proof he was trying to save her, not kill her? A murmur swept through the courtroom. The defense's strategy was clear. Blur the lines, make the jury hesitate. If even one juror felt uncertain, the case could be in jeopardy. Then came the biggest moment of the defense's case. Frank took the stand. For the first time, he spoke directly to the jury. His voice was steady, his performance calculated. I loved Elizabeth, he said. I would never hurt her. His story was carefully crafted. He claimed he had gone to see her that night, that when he arrived, the house was already in flames, and in his panic, he had suffered burns trying to save her. He painted himself not as a killer, but as a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lisa Hammond listened, unimpressed. The defense had spun a compelling lie, but it wouldn't hold up against the truth. There was still more evidence to present. The voicemail. The 3-second recording captured just minutes before the fire started. In it, Elizabeth's voice was panicked, barely above a whisper, followed by the unmistakable sound of a man saying, "You think I won't do it?" The defense would try to argue that the voice wasn't Frank's, that it was inconclusive, but Lisa knew that once the jury heard it, they would know the truth. As the trial continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a battle of evidence. It was a battle of narrative, psychology, and persuasion. The prosecution had science, forensics, and digital records on their side. The defense had manipulation, doubt, and the ability to exploit uncertainty. By the end of the day, as the courtroom emptied and the lawyers prepared for the next round of arguments, one thing was certain. This case was far from over. The jury had been given two stories, one backed by irrefutable evidence, the other built on a carefully constructed lie, and soon they would have to decide which one they believed. The courtroom had become a battlefield of words, logic, and persuasion. The prosecution and the defense had waged a relentless war over the life and crimes of Frank J. Brett Jr., each side pushing the limits of the jury's patience, intellect, and doubt. Both attorneys knew that the final stretch of the trial would determine whether justice would be served or whether the cracks in the system would once again fail a victim who had already suffered enough. Lisa Hammond stood at the prosecution table, her legal pad filled with meticulous notes. She had listened as Frank Brett took the stand the previous day, spinning his story with cold precision, painting himself as a man who had simply arrived too late, who had been burned in a desperate attempt to save Elizabeth. The defense had done exactly what she had expected, blurred the lines, creating just enough uncertainty to make the jury hesitate. But she wasn't done yet. The prosecution still had one last move, one final moment that would cut through the web of lies and force the jury to see what they already knew in their hearts. Frank Brett Jr. had murdered Elizabeth Bell. The morning began with the prosecution's rebuttal case. Lisa stepped forward, facing the jury with the confidence of someone who knew the truth was on her side. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice firm, "we have heard the defense's version of events. They want you to believe that Mr. Brett was an innocent man, that he had no involvement in Elizabeth Bell's death, that he just happened to be there at the wrong time." She let that thought linger before shaking her head slightly. "But we don't deal in coincidences in this courtroom. We deal in facts, and the facts tell a very different story." She turned toward the screen where the voicemail recording had been prepared for playback. "You have heard a lot of words in this courtroom," she continued. "Now I want you to hear Elizabeth's own words. This message was recorded 3 minutes before the fire started, 3 minutes before Elizabeth Bell was trapped in a house she could not escape. Listen carefully." She nodded to the technician, who pressed play. A crackle of static filled the room before Elizabeth's voice emerged, shaky, breathless, barely above a whisper. The background noise was muffled, chaotic. And then just before the recording cut out, a male voice, low, threatening, spoke 6 chilling words. "You think I won't do it?" Silence. The courtroom was still, frozen. Then a ripple of pure, undeniable reaction, a sharp breath from one of the jurors, a hushed murmur from the audience, an almost imperceptible flinch from Frank Brett Jr. at the defense table. Lisa turned back to the jury. "There is no doubt anymore," she said, her voice steady. "This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Elizabeth Bell knew who she was afraid of. She tried to tell us. And now, it's up to you to listen." She sat down. The prosecution rested. The case had reached its peak, and now it was in the hands of the 12 jurors who sat in a separate chamber, their task as heavy as the evidence itself. The weight of the decision sat on their shoulders like an invisible force. A woman had been burned alive, and the man accused of killing her was sitting just yards away, waiting for them to decide his fate. They began by reviewing the strongest points of evidence, the gas station footage, where Frank was seen purchasing gasoline and a lighter just 20 minutes before the fire. The accelerant used at the crime scene, poured at the bedroom door, ensuring that Elizabeth had no escape. The phone records, placing Frank's phone at the crime scene at the exact time of the fire. Elizabeth's final text, "He's here," sent minutes before the fire began. The voicemail, capturing a male voice, Frank's voice, uttering a chilling threat moments before the flames consumed her home. The defense had pushed its narrative hard. They had tried to convince the jury that Frank's burn injuries suggested he had tried to save Elizabeth, that he was simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. But in the end, the evidence was too strong, too precise, too damning to ignore. One by one, the jurors raised their hands. Their decision was clear. The verdict was reached. The judge's gavel struck once, signaling the return of the jury. The room was packed. Elizabeth's family, reporters, spectators, all holding their breath. Frank sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together, his face unreadable. The jury foreperson stood, holding the folded verdict slip. In the matter of the state versus Frank J. Brett Jr., The judge began, his voice measured. On the charge of second-degree murder, how does the jury find the defendant? The foreperson unfolded the slip, took a breath, and then, in a voice that rang through the courtroom like a bell of finality, she spoke. Guilty. A gasp swept through the room. Frank's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his carefully constructed facade. The judge nodded. On the charge of arson, how does the jury find the defendant? Guilty. On the charge of endangering the welfare of a child? Guilty. The final blow had been delivered. Frank Brett Jr. was a convicted murderer. Lisa Hammond let out a slow breath, her work finally complete. She had fought for Elizabeth, for the justice that had eluded her in life, and now justice had found her in death. The sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but it was all but certain. Frank would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As he was led away in handcuffs, he did not look back. The case was over. Elizabeth Bell's voice had been heard, and justice had been served. The courtroom was silent, yet the tension in the air was suffocating. The weight of the verdict still lingered, a stark confirmation of Frank J. Brett Jr.'s guilt. But there was still one final step, the sentencing. The day had arrived for the judge to determine how much of his life Frank would spend behind bars. The fate of a man who had burned a woman alive would soon be sealed. The gallery was packed with spectators, Elizabeth Bell's family, her friends, and members of the public who had followed the case from the moment it began. The news cameras stationed outside the courthouse were broadcasting live updates, ensuring that the world would hear what justice would look like for a man like Frank Brett Jr. The defendant sat at the table, his hands cuffed, his suit slightly wrinkled from weeks of court appearances and nights spent in solitary confinement. He had been convicted of second-degree murder, arson, and endangering the welfare of a child, but he showed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of what he had done. He stared ahead, silent and rigid, as if refusing to process the fact that his life as he knew it was over. The judge, a woman with years of experience handling some of the most heinous crimes imaginable, took her place at the bench. Her face was unreadable, but her voice was steady and resolute. She had seen monsters before, but even she had been shaken by the cruelty of this case. Mr. Brett, she began, her gaze piercing through the weight of the moment, you have been convicted of unspeakable crimes. You planned and carried out an act of pure, deliberate violence, setting a fire designed not just to kill, but to ensure maximum suffering. You took the life of Elizabeth Bell in the most brutal way possible, by trapping her, watching as the flames consumed her, knowing she had no escape. Frank did not flinch. The judge continued. You have never shown remorse. You have never taken accountability. You have manipulated, denied, and attempted to evade responsibility at every turn. The evidence against you was overwhelming, and now you will face the consequences of your actions. A brief pause, then, the sentence. For the crime of second-degree murder, you are sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For the crime of arson, you are sentenced to 20 years, to be served consecutively. For endangering the welfare of a child, you are sentenced to an additional 5 years. In total, you are sentenced to 50 years to life in state prison. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some gasped. Others nodded in silent relief. Frank Brett Jr. would never walk free again. As the judge banged the gavel, signaling the case was officially closed, Elizabeth Bell's mother broke down in quiet sobs. Her daughter was still gone, but at least the man who had taken her would never hurt another person again. Frank was led out in handcuffs. He did not look at anyone. He did not speak. He was no longer a man in control. He was just another prisoner, a forgotten name in a system designed to keep men like him away from the world. The door slammed shut behind him. Justice had been served, but it did not erase the wounds left in the wake of the tragedy. Elizabeth Bell's daughter would grow up without her mother, raised by her grandparents, forced to live with the trauma of a night she barely understood. She had survived the fire, but she would carry its scars for the rest of her life. The Bell family spent months trying to heal, but how could you ever truly heal from something like this? Elizabeth had been a daughter, a mother, a friend, a woman full of life and promise. She had fought to escape an abusive relationship, had done everything right. She had filed a restraining order. She had told people she was afraid. And yet, it had not been enough to save her. Her story became a catalyst for change. Advocacy groups took up her name, pushing for stronger protections for victims of domestic violence. The case highlighted the failures in the system, the gaps that allowed men like Frank Brett Jr. to continue their cycles of control and abuse even after their victims sought help. New laws were proposed, policies reconsidered, shelters received more funding, and outreach programs gained traction. Elizabeth's story, tragic as it was, sparked a movement. Years passed. The world moved on, as it always does, but some names are never forgotten. Frank Brett Jr. would spend his remaining years behind bars, another inmate in a maximum security prison, his name known not for any accomplishments, but for the horror he inflicted upon the woman who tried to leave him. He had controlled Elizabeth in life, but in the end, she had taken his freedom from him in death. Elizabeth Bell's story became a symbol of resilience, of the ongoing fight against domestic violence, of the lives lost to men who believe they own the women who walk away from them. Her daughter, though forever changed, grew up knowing her mother's strength, not just her suffering. She would never forget what was taken from her, but she would also know that her mother's story saved others. And in the end, justice, however imperfect, had found its way to the man who thought he could escape it. Elizabeth Bell had been silenced, but her voice still echoed in the world she left behind. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.